building, first of all, the front yard's much, much bigger. There's a lot smaller trees, but the buildings on the side, which are the barn, are much closer. And there's now a wraparound porch, which didn't exist at that time. Okay, so I just want to give you a feel for the before and after, and part of it is just because over a decade of life occurred. Now, let me see if I can get rid of, I need to stop sharing now. Stop my sharing. All right. Did that work?
Yes. Yes, it did. Okay. Yes.
And now I'm back on the screen. Yay. All right. Now I'm going to do one quick little thing here. Just getting myself in here. All right. So, as she said, I'm with the Lake County History Center. I have been here, oh my goodness. I started as a volunteer around 2008. And within a year or two, I was asked if I could would just fill in for a short period. I think that was 2011, and I'm still doing it. That's sort of what happens around here. And I guess if you've worked with any nonprofits, I think it's the rule for nonprofits. So I'm going to talk about the Lake County Poorhouse, which was a poorhouse for 152 years. So a long time. And when I talk about it, I will tell you quite honestly, most of my conversations around the earlier years. There are a few that are in the later years, but it's a lot easier to talk about. First of all, the stories are better, in my opinion. And second of all, the information is more prevalent. After 1940s and onward, they're very cautious about showing that information in case people are still alive. So some of the records are a little more closed, and I'm honoring that as well, even though we do have access to some of it. So I also want to warn you that there's some language I may use. I don't want to offend anybody. I try not to, but it's the language that they use, and I sort of pick up on it because I'm in this data so much. So if you hear me use, well, first of all, originally in 1816, Ohio passed legislation that required all counties to create a poorhouse. And poorhouse was the term they used at the time. So I'm used to using that term quite a bit. Then in 1846, they changed the name from poorhouse to the county infirmary. And that's very confusing because a few years after that, we built a hospital, and guess what? We call it the infirmary. So if you use the term infirmary, we don't know which building you mean. So I never call it the infirmary. And then the last name in 1919, they decided that they wanted to sound better, and they changed it to the county home. And every once in a while, I'll call it the home. So if you hear me say the home, or you hear me say poorhouse, I'm talking about this building here. And don't be offended by what I might call it. It's just the terms that they use, and I'm following that. In addition, they called people who stayed here inmates. I tend to call them residents, and I think by the end that was the term used, but every once in a while inmates will pop out of my mouth, and that's only because when I'm reading, that's the words they're using, and I'm used to that language. So don't be offended. I'm not trying to be. It's more of what I'm used to seeing. All right, so that being said, I want to talk about the history, and along the way, you're going to hear all kinds of fun stories, some of them ghosts, some of them not so ghosts, that hopefully will help you understand our world here. Oh, and give me a little background. We took over the home in 2008, and we have been here ever since. It is now totally ours. We own it. The commissioners helped us get it, which was an awesome thing. All right, so going back in time, we had the legislation. In 1840, we separated from Geauga County. We actually picked up Willoughby from Cuyahoga, and everybody else was from Lake. And we created Lake County. So that was awesome, but we weren't ready to start a poorhouse. We were just trying to get our feet wet. So it took till 1852 before we established our first poorhouse. And what we did is we bought a farm, the Pettingell Farm, and it was 116 acres of farmland with these outbuildings. And these outbuildings were basically sheds and stables, not much more than that. So after that, a board of directors was brought in to oversee it, to oversee the home. And by the way, in 1919, no, that would be 1919. In 1990, the commissioners took over, and no longer were they run by, no, it was 1919. In 1919, the commissioners of Lake County took over and started running it. But up to that point, we actually had a board of directors, and reading their board of directors notes is a trip. They appointed a superintendent and a matron to run the facility. And the people that I've seen who are superintendents, their wives are traditionally the matrons. So both of them get paid separately for 2 different jobs. The superintendent and his family actually in the Pettingdrove farmhouse, they lived in the farmhouse. They did not want to live with these 4 people. So they put them out in the sheds, and they lived in either the barns or the sheds. That's their only option. Let's see here. At its peak, and over time, at its peak, the county home encompassed 190 acres of land. So it was quite large at the time. Today, our history center sits on 8 acres. We have a tiny, tiny piece of what was here. Now, the first story I'm going to tell you has to do with the fact that we had so much land. In 1890s, Barnum and Bailey Circus came to town, and they had a parade through town, and the circus was here, and it was very cool. Unfortunately, one of their elephants died, and they had to figure out what to do with this elephant, because they were quickly informed you can't bury him in Painesville because there's a law that says you cannot bury domestic animals in the city limits. So they're like, well, where are we going to put this elephant? We're in Painesville. Where can we put it? And somebody came up with the idea of putting it on the poorhouse land. We have 100 and some acres. At that point, it wasn't quite at our peak, but it still was over 120 acres of land. And so go ahead and put it on their land. So now one story I heard chopped up the elephant because it was so big. The other, but in any case, they got it onto a wagon. They pulled it here with horses, and they buried it somewhere on the old grounds. We don't know where. We don't know. We know that when they built Riverside High School, which is built on part of the old land, they did not find it. We know that the Riverside Cemetery is next door, and we know there's a lot of development to the area. It's also possible they built it somewhere where we haven't built anything, so we wouldn't know. We just don't know where they buried it. But I was telling this story about 6 months ago, and this guy was on a tour. I have a behind the scenes tour I was doing, and it was a quiet moment, and I wanted to fill it, so I just popped out with that story. And one of the guys said, wait a minute, I work next door at the cemetery. I actually dig the plots. And when I was digging one time, we found these giant bones that could easily be elephant bones. I think we actually found your elephant. I love the concept. I was so excited. But one of the things I've learned in life is you better get a second or third source. So I called the cemetery and said, any chance you know anything about this? He called me back right as COVID hit, and I never had a chance to follow up with him. I called about a week or 2 ago, and he hasn't gotten back to me, but I did talk to somebody else there, and she goes, I've heard the story. I've never heard of anybody running into the bones. But I like the story, so I'm sticking with he found the bones, and it's over in Riverside somewhere. All right, going on from there then. Oh, hold on. Sorry, my computer decided to be a pain in the butt. It doesn't want to move. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. When it wants to stop, it wants to stop. All right. So people who came here. Women and children could come here if you had nowhere else to go, if you were mentally ill, if you were disabled, if you especially women and children, if you didn't have anywhere to go, no one to support you, you were allowed to come here. If you were male, you could only come here if you were disabled physically, mentally, or if you were older than 45, younger than 16. Their attitude was that if you're between 16 and 45, you should be able to find a job somewhere. We're not going to come here, go find a job. We're not going to let you just work, sit here for free. So, okay, but even if they did come here, quite honestly, life was not easy You were expected to work. In fact, people were kicked out for not working. If you didn't want to work, then leave. That was their attitude. It was a fully functioning farm, and so they not only supported themselves, they also sold to neighbors. In 1891, so this is again, remember it opened in 1850s. By 1891, I read a report that said there were 43 cattle, 39 hogs, 4 horses, 70 tons of hay that they had to take care of. Plus, they had 16 acres of wheat, 14 acres of corn, 20 acres of oats, 30 acres of hay, and 4 acres of potato. So they had a huge farm here to support. They needed these people to go out and do the work. Otherwise, it wasn't going to get done. If you couldn't work outside, there was plenty of work to be done inside the house. Cooking, cleaning, whatever. Handyman. Handyman jobs were an important part of keeping this big building going. It's a huge building. One of my other stories has to do with one of our handymen that was here, Charlie. Charlie was a Civil War soldier, and he worked quite often in the handyman room in the basement. And that room is still the handyman room. We still keep it for that. The guys who do work here, they use that room still to this day. So he worked in there quite often, doing whatever handyman stuff there was, and he put together a Last Supper picture, and there's some reason he really likes it, and it still is on the wall. No one will take it down. On one of our ghost walks, we were going around, and in there we ran into, somehow they became aware that he was there. Charlie was in the room. And so they started asking him, and they said, is there something here you really like? And the answer came back, the picture. They love that picture, don't take it down, was the general thing of it. It's like, all right, we're not taking it down. It is still there to this day, and we're not taking it down. We all know not to. Now, unfortunately, people who came here really had no other options, and many of them were not happy. So he one day decided he'd had enough. He went up to the attic and he hung himself, which is probably why his spirit's still here. In 1876 and 1877, they started the farmhouse was falling apart. There's actually records I have from the state saying, oh, people are just, everything's wonderful with the people. You're treating them well. We like everything about it, but your buildings are falling down. You got to do something about it. So mid-1870s, they found a Benjamin Morse, who was an architect, and he designed the building, and Colonel Arthur McAllister was the one who built it. Now, both of these have a little bit of a tie. Benjamin Morse actually was born in Kirtland, grew up in Painesville, and so he was sort of a homegrown guy. And as I said, he's the one who designed it. He worked for Cleveland and was the head of the building department there. He supervised building the Union Station in Cleveland. Sort of cool. Colonel McAllister is actually well known for building houses on Millionaire's Row. Many of the houses were built by him. And he also built the Sailors and Soldiers Monument, or Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Public Square. So he's rather well known. How we got two people so well known is beyond me. I think it was their ties. They both had a little bit of ties to Lake County. All right, so the building you're in right now actually is, I would consider, when I came here, I'm like, really, this is the poorhouse? It seems rather nice for a poorhouse. And that is true, sort of. In fact, in that era, they wanted to make the house look nice. That was sort of on purpose for all of these poorhouses that were built. The attitude was, if you to hide the poor away, if you leave a good impression on the outside, then everybody will think everything's good on the inside. It was a way to show off the wealth of our county, quite honestly. We had Little Mountain that brought a lot of money in. We had great natural resources between the iron out in Madison and the shipyards we had. We had quite a few ports. Our ports competed with Cleveland at the time in the early days. By 70s, Cleveland had overshot us though, but still, we had a lot of natural resources here. And so because of that, we wanted to flaunt it a little bit. And that wasn't terribly unusual, again, to have that happen. Let's see, what else do I want to tell you about the home? Oh, so the superintendent lived in the front of the building. Our building is built like a cross, and the small top of the cross is where the superintendent lived. There's 4 rooms down, 4 rooms up, and then there is a set of doors that were always locked, and the other side was where the, quote, inmates or the residents lived. There was a front door, which now gone. We now have a window, but there was a front door. People would come in, you'd meet with the superintendent, and then you were off to do work. And they would assign you a room, they'd assign you work, and there you went. And you just did that. It's reported that that the children of the superintendent, because they were so separate, there's a few stories where the children didn't even realize that they lived in the poorhouse. There was no clue of that because they were so separate. In their house, tall ceilings, beautiful, beautiful architecture. There's just an amazing thing to see. All right, so in 1897, the county decided they needed to have a hospital. And so they built the county hospital right here on the grounds. In fact, it's just a few yards away from our building. And that was great for a few years, but it didn't take long before people were like, do I really want to go to the poorhouse in order to go to the hospital? They didn't like that, and a group of ladies got together and decided to build a new hospital. They collected money from various people, and they were able to build the first hospital in Painesville or the first other hospital, and everybody started going there except for us. So most people ended up going to what ultimately became Lake East, now Tri-Point, but we were still able to use the infirmary here. After the Lake County home closed, they sold it to Riverside High School, and Riverside actually intended to tear down this building and build a new, oh boy, I hate when the words escape me, not Board of Elections, school board, a new school board building here. But somebody decided maybe saving it, and they came to the Lake County History Center or Lake County Historical Society and said, would you be interested, we know you're outgrowing your space, would you be interested in this building? And we said, yes, of course we are. We'd love to help save it. We love the idea of being there. And with some help from the commissioners and quite a few volunteers, we were able to move into this building and save it from demolition. I know that's a hot topic now because there are so many buildings that are losing their edge. They're getting older, and we can't save them all, but we save them one by one by one. Steel Mansion is one that was saved. Unionville Tavern is one, and this was one. And there are several throughout the county. We have to make choices. We have to find people willing to do it, but I'm glad we were able to help with that process of saving one of our old buildings. All right, so in 1852, the first inmate or resident was accepted into the poorhouse, and her name was Caroline Cole. And according to records, she was feeble-minded. She was a feeble-minded woman from Perry. The records here are sort of fascinating to read and to try to interpret. Unfortunately, they only give little pieces of detail, and sometimes you have to work around to figure out what it is. But it is interesting to interpret it. So Caroline, feeble-minded lady, was the first one. People came here from all over the place, or actually from Lake County, but from all different kinds of ways. It wasn't unusual for a family member to drop them off. You get tired of your mother-in-law, drop her off at the poor folks' home and go on home, and you don't have to deal with her anymore, I guess. If you were unwed pregnant, guess what? Dropped it off. We actually have a lot of records that use the word enceinte. I think I'm saying that correctly. It's French, and it means pregnant. They didn't put it in English for some reason. I think that was their way, again, that Victorian way of hiding that little piece of information. Now, one man dropped off his pregnant wife because, I don't know why, but as soon as the baby was born, he showed back up, picked her and the baby up, and went back home. Only thing I could figure out is he saved himself a hospital bill. I don't know. I have no idea why he did it. Again, I'd love to know the whys. It's not in there. Another person was dropped off with their insurance policy, and the commissioners accepted the insurance policy, and basically when they died, the home got the money from the insurance policy. So I guess keeping them at home wasn't worth the money for them. Who knows? Some people came here voluntarily. They had nowhere else to go. One of them, who we know, we talk about here quite often, is Catherine. Catherine was a foster child, and she went to school, came home one day, and her bags were packed on the front porch. Her foster mother informed her it was her 18th birthday. She had aged out of the system, and since she wasn't getting paid anymore, she wasn't going to keep her in the house. So you're on your own. Figure out what you're going to do and just take these bags and go. And her only choice was to come to the home. So she did. She came to the home. She lived here for 46 years. And in 2003, she ended up going, when they were working on closing the home, she moved to assisted living. She lived there for 9 years, and she died 2 weeks before Halloween. Given the history of the building, I like to think that Halloween may have played into it somehow. Now, she is one of the ghosts that has shown up in this building for us. On one of our lantern tours, they went in the room that we know is her room. She lived there all the years, and they asked her what her favorite color was. And we all know her favorite color is red, but we were waiting to see what would be said. And we heard on the recording very clearly, red. But then what's really wild is a deeper voice right afterwards says, black. So somebody was in the room with Catherine, whether she wanted them to or not. We had a little double ghost going on that day. You might come here if you were sick and hurt. If you were, a lot of people in our records were missing limbs, missing a hand, leg, foot, arm, maybe because they lost it when they were, with working with tools. When the trains came through, it wasn't unusual to lose it because of the trains. There's a lot of different reasons why they could lose it, but they would. Bright's disease, which is a kidney disease, actually shows up quite a bit. Consumption, which is TB. Feeble-minded is not an unusual term. It was actually one of the bigger ones that I saw on the list. Old and feeble, that one sort of scares me that I need to go to a home when I'm old and feeble, because I sort of feel like that some days. Imbecile, invalid and helpless, partly blind, dysentery, inclined to idiocy, brain fever, whatever that is. The list goes on, and it's just an unbelievable list of people. So I want to tell you about Lyman Rose. He's one of the men who came through. He was 90 years old. And he was called, on the records, they actually say destitute, insane, and is moving about and ought to be taken care of. So he came here. 3 weeks after he came here, his son Connie picks him up and takes him home with him. It didn't last long. 10 months later, he comes back, and what's written in the records is he was so troublesome, the people could not endure it any longer. So they brought him back. He died 6 months later, and his son-in-law did come and bury him in the cemetery. You also might end up here because of the courts. They might, or some other authority might force you to come here. Elizabeth fits that story. She was 6 years old. Her brother William was 2 years old, and they were abandoned by their parents. And so their mother, basically the authorities found out about it, took them and brought them to the home to live. After a while, their mother, I guess, felt bad about what she did, and she came back, picked them up, and said, promised she would never abandon them again. And they let her take them with her. If you were hurt, you might end up in our hospital. And if you ended up in the hospital, it wasn't unusual that after you were in the hospital, you would come here, especially if you couldn't go back to work, because again, you have no money if you can't go back to work. And so quite a few people started out in the hospital and end up here. Some of them came voluntarily until they could get their feet on the ground again. The Whitney family is that. It was a husband, a wife, and 6 kids from 2 to 12. That is a full family. He lost his job, and they didn't know what to do, so they came here. They lived for 1 year. At the end of the year, according to the records, they left to provide for themselves. It wasn't a great environment, especially I'm sure for kids. Remember, you have to work a lot. But it was a stopgap measure for them to make it from where they had nothing to where they could get themselves back to making it again. Now, surprisingly, some people were paid to live here, or they paid so they could live here. I don't know who would choose to do that, and I think most of the time, the ones I saw was where somebody else paid for them to stay here. So like Mrs. Sophia Waite, she was 58 and she brought her son, or she was brought here by her son-in-law, and he agreed to pay $100 a year if they would keep her. So obviously he was very fed up with her. The records claim that she had been very insane for a number of years. At least that must be what the son said, right? Whether she really was or not, who knows, but he wanted her gone. She died 2 months later, and her family came and did bury her in Willoughby, where they lived. And so, you know, she wasn't here very long. I'm sure it was sort of depressive to be here. Another person who came through here and paid was Gideon Crowford. He arrived in 1868. He wanted to stay until spring. So my guess is that it was a winter, and we see this quite often, quite honestly, where during the winter they came here, and then when the spring came and the weather got nice, they were off. They would go off and wander around and camp out, and it didn't matter. Come fall, they came back. One of my friends here uses the term that they're going on their summer constitutional because they would be gone for the summer. But Gideon was another person who wanted to do that. He wanted to stay until spring, and he agreed to pay $1 a week in advance. After 4 weeks, he left, having only paid $6.75. I'm guessing he decided actually the cold was better than living here. About 5 years later, though, he came back, and this time I get the impression he was brought back. It was not by choice. He lasted about 3 months this time, so a little longer, and in the middle of winter, January 8th, he crawled out a window and departed for parts unknown, according to the record. So he wanted gone. To leave by the window, he really wanted to be gone. But that didn't last long either. He was back the next day. I guess once he slept out one night overnight, January 8th, that was enough for him to decide to come back. And so then again, he left. He stayed around 10 months and left again, this time to care for himself. And at least this time, though, he did walk out of the door instead of crawling out of the window. Again, he didn't stay too long. He stay away too long. He came back 2 weeks later, and this time, from what we can tell, he didn't leave. Okay, so living here was not easy, as I've alluded to. If the person was found to be from another county or state, they would be transferred out immediately. We weren't going to pay for somebody we didn't have to pay for. I do have one county paying for us to keep somebody. So I think it wasn't worth the moving, or they were already so full that they paid us to keep them. If you got some people left because they got a job. Others would be taken to the state hospital down in Columbus. If you were for orphan children, we had a lot of children early on, but then I noticed the numbers went down, and what I found out is that there was a law that went into effect saying that the children couldn't come here by themselves. And so they would come here for a short period, but then we transfer them to the Columbus or to the Cleveland orphanage. And then later years, it switched to the Columbus orphanage. And they might stay here 2 or 3 weeks before somebody would come pick them up, and then they would go. I read a record of one lady who I think they didn't know how long she was going to stay when she first came. And once they realized that she was going to stay, then they sent her down. They called and had the orphanage come and bring her home or take her back there. Based on the records, it looks like what they view children as younger than 13 or 14, because we definitely had several 14-year-old children that stayed around here. We call them children today. Back then, I think they were considered adults. Some people went to live with families. Maddie Estelle is one of those. This is again 1860s from Madison. She was pregnant at 19 with no means of support. So she came, she gave birth on July 1st. And August 27th, she took her daughter and she ran out at night with Ed Plimpton. I don't know who Ed Plimpton is, but I'm assuming I can't find him in the records of the infirmary so far, I'm going to assume he was a worker here and not an inmate, but we don't really know if he was a resident here. 1 week later, she came back with the baby, but without Ed. And shortly after that, she went to live with Dia Seeley. Dia, I think, might be part of the Seeley family, and I'm assuming quite often the wealthy were involved here in Form, so I'm wondering if she took her to find another place for her to live. That is my speculation, but I haven't been able to research that yet. I can't find her. When I went looking for Seeley's, she didn't pop up, so I'm going to keep looking for that. And I'm also going to look for Maddie to see if maybe she showed up later down the road in census, and I can figure out what happened in her life. It's always fun to do that when we can. Maddie was raised by a single mother in Ashtabula. We do know that. But 2 years later, after she left here, I did find that she was working as a domestic in a home in downtown Cleveland with a family that had 8 kids. So sort of crazy. She did marry, oh, you know what? I did find that. I forgot. I found that today. We did find that she did marry eventually. So that's sort of cool too. Some went AWOL without permission. You have all kinds of things of he just left. And he left without asking, and all those kinds of things. Some people, as I mentioned, would come and go, like the summer constitutional. Eleanor is one, she's one that, oh, poor Eleanor. When we talk about come and go, that's Eleanor's name. She came in 1958, so she was a little later. She was 57, and a year and a half after she got here, she left to get married. She went looking for a husband, I guess, while she was here, and eventually found one, left, got married. But unfortunately, that didn't last very long. 5 months later, she's back, about 6 months later, she's back at the home because she's left her husband. It wasn't quite as good as she thought it would be. Then about 5 months later, she's had it here again. And so she found a job as a domestic and did that. That only lasted 5 years because she didn't like, I guess, being a domestic. And she ended up moving to West Virginia, and we sort of lost track of her. We don't know what happened to her after that. My guess is nothing was ever right, and she just kept moving. Hopefully someday she found her right and she stayed put, but we don't really know. Many people died from illnesses, from natural causes, and suicide actually was quite prevalent here. Wyatt Wycox was a 77-year-old peddler. He was a Civil War vet. And he was visiting a friend, clearly depressed, and he decided to kill himself. So he got a knife and he cut himself in the neck. But he missed his jugular. They brought him to the hospital here, and they sewed him up. And he was doing quite well. A month and a half later, he was able to get out of bed, and the first thing he did was go up to the attic and hang himself. So again, this attic, unfortunately, is one of the areas they did tend to hang themselves. It's not the only one, but it happened quite often. Now, Wyatt does show up on our ghost hunts now and then. One day, there was a person, we have a Para-X program where we bring heavy-duty equipment and we section people off into small groups with somebody who is an experienced investigator, and they watch out for paranormal experiences. And they were in this small closet we have, our pantry, and they were running their EMF machine, and when they got back, when they were there, they heard something, and they said, "Who is this?" And clearly they hear on their machine, Wyatt Wilcox, which is sort of wild because at that time, these people did not know about him. And so he came out and he said, "Hey, Kathy, any chance you've ever heard of a Wyatt Wilcox? Because he's in the closet over there." And they said, "Yeah, we know who he is. We know his history. And it's sort of wild that he's still here." Because of some of the terrible things that happened here, because of all the number of deaths that occurred and the terrible deaths that occurred, and the fact that many of them were buried right next door. They were all moved to Evergreen, but they were buried there for a number of years. That's why we think we have so many ghosts here that keep showing up, is that miserable life and that miserable circumstances lead to people just not being ready to go. Not everybody actually was allowed to stay. A few people got kicked out of this place. One man was kicked out for hitting Myrtle with his fist. That's all it says in the book. He was told not to ever come back again, which I thought was sort of funny. John was asked to leave because he was found well and healthy, so there's no use for him here. Basically, you're well enough, go find a job. And that was 1890. One man was a carny worker, and he was told to leave because he was unkempt, drooled, did not change clothes, stank, and was slovenly. This is in the record books. So not everybody could stay, and especially highly contagious. Smallpox is one thing they would not take. There's one story of a man that came down with smallpox, and he came to the door here, and when he said that he had smallpox, they said, you can't come in here, and they told him to go sit by the side of the road and die. And that's literally what he did. He went down to the road, sat down there, and stayed there until he died, and they buried him right about where he was sitting, which I find terribly, terribly sad that it got to that point. But at that time, in the 20th century, 19th century, they just didn't have anything they could do about it. And vaccine wasn't available until the 20th century. We have a basement. Everybody who knows our building asked me about the basement. We do have a basement. It has 4 7-foot wide cells in it. It's built in a garrison approach. It's actually sort of cool architecture in there too, interestingly enough. But the back of the cells are all open. At some point, somebody did build a wall between 2 and 2, and we think it's because they stopped using 2 of them and only used the other 2. And so that wall was built in so that they didn't have the full space. So we have these cells, and people would be put in the cells. You could be put there because you caused trouble, or because you were insane, or because, honestly, epileptic. They did not understand why you were shaking and doing what you're doing, so they put you in the cell. They didn't know what else to do with you. One of my other stories has to do with Lucy Stockwell, and Lucy ended up in the cells. Lucy was known to run around Painesville naked. And she was picked up by the police and taken to court and was committed to the home here. So she had no choice. She was forced to come here. The only thing, and so, what could you do? In fact, the records say she was a little deranged, but she would, anytime she would escape from here, take off her clothes, and go running through Painesville Square. Again, don't know why. I guess clothes just bothered her. So they would keep bringing her back, and she'd do it again. They'd bring her back. Well, at some point, the only thing they knew to do was to put her in the cells so she would stop escaping. And she spent most of her time at the end in the cells. Somehow one day, and I don't know how, I don't know if she was working besides being in the cell and she escaped then or what, but she escaped one last time. And this time they found her naked downtown, frozen to death. She wasn't able to survive without her clothes, without the extra warmth. So the idea at the time was to keep her well, but she wasn't happy about it. I'm not sure which is worse in some ways. It sounds like she was just in a miserable situation, but there wasn't better answers back then for her. They did stop putting the insane and the epileptic in the cells. Well, one record says 1898, another says 1920, so depending on the source. Sometime around then. Now, what's really wild about the cells is we used to go down, when we go down there, we're not allowed to take groups down there because it doesn't have the doors don't go the right direction. And so, but we will every once in a while go down there, and we've taken some pictures. And every time we take pictures, you will see gold orbs showing up, multiple gold orbs showing up. And it's not from lights because the lights are turned off. They just are there. It's really wild. Not all of our stories from the home are bad. They make for the better stories, obviously, but honestly, the other side of it is that the earlier centuries just did not treat people who were ill or who were handicapped or who were poor very well. And so this is what they did. So, all right, before I want to end with a few extra ghost stories that didn't quite fit with my stories, but they're just great ghost stories, so I have to tell them. Kathy Weber is one of the haunted housewives from Willoughby, and does a lot of investigating here. She does our lantern tours where you hear the ghost stories. She does our Para X where you actually do the investigating. And so in the early days, she did a lot of research through the home, and she's actually a great source for me as I try to pique her memory. But she frequently, when she does her investigation, she will frequently record somebody saying, "Get out." It's said quite often. And other people have heard it too. She's not the only one it's occurred to, but she's like, "Oh yeah, they're always saying get out. Don't worry about it. They don't want to see her." She's heard lots of unexplained signs here, or sounds here. But what really was interesting to me is she said a few times when she's had to miss one of her programs and some of the other investigators have come out, the ghost will ask where she is, which I think is absolutely hilarious that they know her so well, they wonder where she is. Back in last October, Marianne Winkowski, who's known to be she was the one that the Ghost Whisperer was based on, the TV show. So she actually calls herself the Ghost Whisperer. And she came here and did a reading, and she went through the house and then went out to the barn and was telling us what she found. And I had to laugh because she said, oh, she was talking about various things, but she mentioned, she goes, oh, there's a George I ran into. And we're like, okay, I know of two Georges that we've run into before. And she said, well, George says he's messing with the furnace. And we're like, the furnace? He said, yeah, the coupler on the furnace. Well, what she didn't know is our furnace was only like 4 years old, maybe. And that year, that winter before she came, we had that furnace break down again and again and again. We could not keep it going without bringing a repairman. In fact, we were talking about, what do? We can't keep paying a repairman. It's too expensive for us. And so I'm like, okay, now we know who's doing it. We found out it's George Kovich. We actually got a last name too. George Kovich did it. And so I went up to her and I said, what can I do to keep George away from the furnace? Because I need to save some money here. We can't keep paying for this. And what I was told is you want a keep seed. And I said, okay, but this little seed, it's a tiny, tiny seed. This little seed will blow off the furnace. So somebody who was there had a small metal casing that she had around her neck with a key seed in it. And she gave it off and gave it to me and said, put it on the furnace. Ghosts will stay away from key seed. It keeps them away. We did that. And last winter, I did not have one repair, which is pretty amazing. So far, we turned the furnace on this week. We have not had any problem yet with the furnace. I'm hoping for another good year. I hope that means George is done with telling us or with breaking up our furnace, because we can't keep paying for that. So I'm optimistic. We have Kent State alumni come for a day of caring in the spring, and they help us do a spring cleaning. And one year a man came and he was cleaning the windows in our rental hall, Heritage Hall. He was cleaning the windows in there, and he looked and he noticed there was a little girl in the doorway, and he was really surprised because he hadn't seen any children earlier. And he wondered, like, who brought the child, that, okay, maybe, some people were a little on the younger side. And he didn't think anything about it, and he finished what he was doing, walked over to the other side where the doorway was to wipe down the windows there too. And when he looked, he saw the little girl he looked through the hallway, she was in the reception area. And he thought, oh, there she is. But in front of his eyes, she disappeared. He freaked. He comes running out and he goes, you didn't tell me you have ghosts here. You didn't tell me you have ghosts here. I'm sensitive. I don't go where there are ghosts. I don't like them. They like me. He went out and he said, I knew I'd been feeling sick all morning, but I just thought I was sick, that that's what ghosts do to me. I should have included him by that. He wasn't. He went, set out in the yard. Supposedly, now somebody told me this. I had not heard this part of it. Somebody else told me that he heard that she appeared one more time to him when he was sitting out on the picnic tables outside, and then disappeared, and he finally felt better after that. I don't know about that, but he was freaked out from that girl being here. And by the way, he's never come back to a day of caring. He will not come back here no matter what. We also had a young man from Jamaica who was doing community service here. And he was working down in the basement and he heard some clicking sounds going on and he thought, what is going on? And he went into our artifact room where we keep many of our collection pieces. And he found an old manual typewriter and the keys were clicking and they were moving. And he was like, what is going on? So he came upstairs rather quickly and said, there's something going on here. The keys are moving. So we thought it was wild. He did not want to go back by himself downstairs. After he was done with his community service, we passed the story on to Kathy. And Kathy was giving a tour one time, and at that time we were down in the basement, and she told this story about actually I think it was upstairs, but she told the story about the cash register and how the clicking and how this guy had heard it. And the guy said, I can attest to that because that was me that had actually happened to. And yes, that's exactly what happened. And I do not want to go back in that area again. Good thing he can't go down in the basement, right? Because we're not allowed. And let's see. I think this will be my last story before I do a little conclusion. My last story has to do with some Kirtland High School students. So all the seniors, as you know, do this senior project. And Kirtland, a group of kids decided they were going to make their senior project be paranormal investigation. So they contacted Kathy and said, can you help us with this? Yeah, no problem. We get you into the home and and actually she checked with us and yes, she could bring some students and they would do their investigation here. On the way to the event or to meet with her, they decided, maybe we should have a tape recorder. So they stopped at a store and bought a tape recorder. And so came to the place and they were walking around and ended up on the second floor. And she said, you know what, turn on your tape recorder and walk down to the end of the hallway. 8 or 10. Walk down to the end of the hall and back with your tape recorder going, and let's see if we hear anything. So they did that, and you could hear the steps as they were going down the hall, and they come back, and she said, okay, let's rewind the tape. So she rewinds the tape, and on the tape, you hear somebody whistling, very clearly whistling a tuneless song, but whistling away, and they did not hear it with the naked eye, but they could hear it on this tape recorder. The kids, not needless to say, were thrilled to death that they actually got a ghost experience while they were here. I want to leave on a good note. And from 1970 to 1985, the former mayor of, I think it's Perry, was the superintendent here, and his wife was the matron. And in a 2005 interview, Bob said, for his time here, we promoted a family atmosphere, not an institutional environment. This was their home, and we felt close to those who lived here. Everyone did their part to help out. So although when I talk about the 1800s, the 19th century, which most of my stories are from, those times were tough times, and even in the turn of the century. But by the end, the people who lived here were treated more passionately, I guess is the right word. Were treated more appropriately and more like what we would expect today. And I was sort of glad to hear that, he really worked hard to do that. And my guess is some of the prior generation or prior superintendents to him might as well. But clearly when you go back into the 20s and 1920s and prior, no. All right, so I've talked a lot, probably longer than you wanted me to. There's just so many cool stories. Are there questions? I didn't really see anything show up on my screen. No?
No, we don't have any other questions. We did have someone who was interested in seeing the photos again, but that person left. So okay. We don't have to go through all that. Sharing your screen, that's a whole process. It's not as easy.
You either share it or you don't. Yeah.
Yeah. So if anyone else
on the furnace. So it was a small gold case. It was like this. It looked like a piece of jewelry. She actually was wearing it across her neck, and it was hollow on the inside, and she had a keep seed in it. And there was little gaps on the side so you could see the keep seed a little bit inside it, but not much because it's a very small seed. So that, but what they told me is you can just put a plain quince seed. That will keeps bad spirits away. What's the other thing they say it does besides that? It keeps bad spirits away. It keeps ghosts in general away, but it's supposed to be like a good thing that you have one of those around. So if you have things disappearing a lot, you feel like there's negative energy, they recommend quince seed.
What is it, seed? What's the name of, how do you spell it?
Quince.
Oh, quince seed.
Okay. What is it?
Quince.
Quince? Okay, I call it quince. I guess it's quince.
Okay.
Quince seed. So yeah, so it's a tiny, tiny seed, but supposedly it's supposed to help with bad energy, including ghosts. There's a lady who has a house up north of here, and she was saying that things kept moving in her house, and she swears no one was doing it. And they put out the quince seed, and suddenly they don't have that issue anymore.
Interesting.
I did want to mention, I put it in the chat, but Kathy Weber, our famous Willoughby ghost lady, is doing a presentation for, it's supposed to be for teens and tweens. It's a ghost lady talk for teens and tweens. So it's going to be, but I'm sure our adults that are here tonight would get a lot out of watching that as well. So we have a question, are the tours still going on? So do you still do tours at the Lake History?
We do. They are smaller groups. So we do a behind the scenes tour where we talk about the history of the building, the things we did to it, and show you some of the artifacts that are in our collection that aren't out. And then we also have a lantern tour, which is actually going on right this moment. That's what the guy sticking his head in a few minutes ago was about. And we do that as well. That is a ghost walk, and we tell you the story. We have dowsing rods, and we'll ask questions and get responses. It's amazing to watch these rods go crazy on some of these questions. And then we also have a Para X that's really heavy duty. I can't do it. I don't have the attention span, because you come for I think it's 3 or 4 hours at least. Kathy manages this. You sit with equipment that they bring in, and a small group, there's an investigator with each group, and you wait for a little bit, then you take a break, you have a snack, and then you go back and you go to a different site and try it, and you end up going to multiple sites for 30 to 45 minutes trying to find something. And usually they do, quite honestly. As a little side note, it's nothing to do with ghosts, but it has to do with cemetery. We do have a cemetery walk at Kirtland Historic Cemetery this coming Saturday, and we are selling tickets through tomorrow. So I know it's sort of last minute, but we do still have a few spots left at the 4:30, 5:15 and the 4:30. The 6 is completely sold out. We are limiting to 10 people, and all of our tours here tend to limit to 10, 12. That's how we get around. So basically, we're giving you a lot less people. But those are our tours. Oh, and we do a group tour of the museum if you ever want to do that. I had one for Halloween one year. They called and said, we have a bus and we're going to various places. Can we come and do a Halloween tour there? I went, sure. So they brought a bus and we did a Halloween tour.
I assume they can find all that information on your website.
You know, I shouldn't say this publicly, but our website needs some help. We have an old platform and we need to update it, and we're working on trying to get some funding to do that. So yes, it is out there. Look under, I think it's, but if it's hard to find, call.
Yeah,
is what I recommend. Our Facebook is a good place to look, honestly. And we also use Eventbrite if you're used to Eventbrite. We have a page called lakehistory.eventbrite.com.
Okay, I think that's all the questions.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I talked a lot, but I get excited about this place.
Tonya, thank you so much. It was exciting, and I want to come out there and look around a little.
Absolutely.
And thank everyone for coming tonight.
It is a beautiful building, and the upstairs display of the Mounds Club in Willoughby.
Yes, that's still here. That will be going down sooner or later, but for right now, it's still here.
Oh, it's not permanent.
No, That is not permanent. I don't think I think it'll be around for a bit longer. We haven't talked about changing it just yet. The problem we were talking about the other day, I'm like, it's just such a nice room, and some of the things they did, we're not ready to take it down, I don't think. But eventually it will. I just don't know when.
Oh, okay. Well,
It's not imminent, but it will at some point.
okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for the talk. It was interesting.
Oh, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
My girlfriend's one son was there, and he had some kind of mental issues, I think, after being beat up by someone. And he was in the home at one time, but I really don't remember the parameters, and she has dementia now, so I'm not sure I could ever get that story. But I know she said he lived there at one time.
Again, anybody who had any kind of disability, mental, physical, whatever, could come here no matter what your age, what your gender, it didn't matter.
Yeah, he had to be in, I would say, in his late 20s.
Okay. The only people they did, again, if it was kids, at some point they started sending them to the orphanage instead of staying here, but that really was the only people that they sent away out. And then, of course, men, if you were able-bodied, they tell you to get out and work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think because of this beating, he wasn't able to do that. What, maybe they couldn't keep him at home. I'm not sure what the whole story was, but he did end up living there for a while.
Right, and that's why any disabled ended up coming here. They wouldn't, that was okay because you obviously couldn't work. It would be the assumption.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, library.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
You're welcome.
I listened to Elliot last week, and she was really very good too. And we talked about the display at the home, which was going to be the next week. And so I was like, oh, that's cool that it kind of comes together. So, yeah. Thank you again.
Yep.
You're welcome.
All right, so if no one else has any other questions, I think I'm going to go ahead and end the event for everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us, and make sure you look in our program guide. We're actually, our new event calendar will be coming out very soon, very soon actually. I'm not, no spoilers, but there's a lot of really great programs coming up in November and December as well. So we hope you will continue to join us for all that kind of stuff. Okay. So have a great evening, everyone, and thank you again so much, Tonya.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.